Today on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Klawans, professor of religion and Jewish studies at Boston University and one of the foremost scholars on ancient Jewish purity, sacrifice, and the temple. His first book won Best First Book awards from both the American Academy of Religion and the American Academy for Jewish Research. He's published 4 major works with Oxford University Press. He's been featured on This American Life, and his research has fundamentally reshaped how scholars understand the ancient world that shaped the Bible. Here's the problem. Most of us were taught that Old Testament purity laws were about sin, that impurity meant you'd done something wrong, and that Jesus came to sweep the whole oppressive system away. Dr. Klawans says we've got it backwards. Ritual impurity and moral impurity were not always the same thing, and oftentimes in 2 different categories in ancient Jewish thought, and collapsing them into one has created centuries of confusion. Sacrifice wasn't primitive, it wasn't empty, it was deeply symbolic, designed to imitate God and maintain his presence among his people. Today, we're going to dismantle some assumptions, recover what the ancient system actually meant, and ask what it changes for how we read the prophets, the Gospels, and Jesus himself. Now it's time to dig in. Welcome everybody to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, and today we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Jonathan Klawans. Thank you so much, Dr. Klawans, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's jump into the convo. I know we're going to be talking a lot on impurity laws, sin, things like that. And when most people hear impurity, they immediately think sin. But you've argued that ancient Jews saw these as completely different categories. So what's the distinction in that?
Well, not quite completely different categories, but so yes, right. Modern, sometimes when we approach, we think of impurity as dirt, we think of it as sin, sometimes we think of it as caste. All of these things get in the way. But in the Hebrew Bible, the purity language is used in 2 distinct ways, primarily, I have argued. And one, which is the impurities we often think about when thinking about the Hebrew Bible, are these things that substances that come from the body, corpses, and different kinds of, dirty or, unclean, impure things. And in the Hebrew Bible, these things produce a period of defilement, which means separation from the sacred, and then it's resolved by bathing, washing hands in some cases, washing, and other purification rites. And these defilements are temporary. Usually, sometimes they may last a week, a little bit more, a little bit less. The various details are in Leviticus and the book of Numbers. But these things aren't sinful, right? It's not sinful to die. It's not sinful to have birth, which is a defilement, which is certainly a source of defilement in Leviticus chapter 12. And sexual activity is defiling, and that too is commanded in Leviticus within constraints. So these things are natural, unavoidable, right?
Right.
And then the defilements are temporary. Then there are other passages in the Hebrew Bible where purity language is used differently. Where, like in Leviticus 18 or Leviticus 20, where sin defiles the land, and sometimes if it gets really bad, leads to exile. Now, this isn't simple sin. This is big stuff. Sexual transgressions, idolatry, bloodshed,
Sure.
major transgressions. And the purity language is also used there. However, there's also some differences, right? These big transgressions are sometimes described as abominations with the Hebrew word toiva, whereas the first category, the ritual purities, are not. So there's some overlapping terminology, and then there's some ways of separating this out. And the mistake many people make is either conflating these 2 things or thinking that some language is figurative and some not. The language is functionally being used the same way, in terms of linguistics, right? That things are doing things, things are defiling things. Um, so neither is metaphorical necessarily, but there's a difference, right? They don't get conflated in the Hebrew Bible. And therefore, when people think all defilement is sinful, that's the mistake.
Yeah, it's a great point. One of the main purposes that I really wanted to get you on is this mindset where, again, you think impure as a Christian when it's taught impure, sin, evil, wicked, and you mentioned some great things like menstruation, childbirth, dying. To think that you're doing something wrong or impure because you're naturally going through these things, I think does a lot of damage in general. It's along the signs in the Christian realm of the teaching, like the born into sin, that we're no good, that we were just always just guard. It like kind of takes away the value aspect. So I think this is going to be just such an important conversation. As you mentioned, ritual impurity comes from things like childbirth, menstruation, touching a corpse, and these aren't sins. What was the actual purpose of the purity system if it wasn't about moral failure?
That's a good question. We don't, we don't really know, but we can guess, right? Part of it has to do just reading the various passages of the Bible, the flipping of right defilement is things one stay away from. So what's the purpose? One of the purpose is achieving sanctity, right? So the idea, the impurities, natural, unavoidable, yes, but the impacts involve separation from the sacred, right? So when one is impure, right, there's a myth about separating from the house, or maybe lepers would be have to leave the camp, and different, but for the most part the real impact would have been felt that impure people weren't allowed into, well, the tabernacle and then the temple, right? And so that's real, right? And then there's the passage, right? What if I'm impure and I can't perform sacrifice? Well, you got to wait a month. There's a passage about that in the Pentateuch as well, right? So there's a concession made, but the sanctity is maintained, right? But now that impact, right? On one hand, that's negative, but that's negative information that we can turn around, right? Where if we put it differently, purification, separating from these things, is what allows us, what allows ancient Israelites, right? Right, allows ancient Israelites to enter the tabernacle, encounter sacred space, and it's part of the preparation of encountering holiness. And so, then we can try to extrapolate my own theory I bandied about. It may or may not be correct, but I think there's insight into ancient Israelite theology here. Why would Israelites want to separate? Yes, sex is commanded, death is inevitable, but why would one want to separate these things in order to encounter the deity? Well, the God of Israel is singular, does not partner. Sex has nothing to do with God. God is immortal, doesn't die, right? So when human beings temporarily separate themselves, symbolically, or it's not just symbolic, right? Maybe even a sacramental way, right? This is efficacious ritual that they are able to encounter God by kind of imitating him.
Gotcha. I know you pointed out, as we spoke briefly, that some of these impurities are unavoidable, and honestly sometimes required. Can you walk us through an example of how like the system actually worked if you are impure, if you touch the corpse? Like what needs to happen?
So yeah, so there are different. So one identifies a source of defilement. You tossed out you guys asked us to consider the corpse. So let's do that. And then there would be different ways, right? A corpse can defile within a small amount of space, even aerially, right?
Okay.
So one doesn't even necessarily have to touch it in Leviticus 15, in Numbers 19. But of course, touching it would convey that defilement as well. Now, the first thing one has to do, right, is presumably one might be touching that corpse because one's preparing it for burial and one's doing all right. So then one continues to do those activities. Um, and now we have to proceed on two levels, especially with corpse impurity. So let's consider what the person who has done this must do, right? And then obviously finish that activity and then engage in a process of purification, which involves a period of time. It involves a period of bathing. It also involves a period of, rituals of purification that are performed at distinct moments in time. The precise timeline is in Numbers 19. Now, Numbers 19 is a really interesting text because of what it also does is tell the story of a special substance that priests need to produce in order to effect purification from corpse impurity. And that's the mysterious and complicated ritual of the red heifer, right? Which needs to be burned not in the temple, right? It's actually this the ritual, the preparation of this substance takes place out of the temple, the red heifer, and then it's slaughtered. It's then burned. The ashes are then mixed into a substance that then is used as special purification waters, right? And that has to have happened already. And
Right.
then there's an irony there that loops back to the question that we began with. The priests that prepare this substance are defiled by that process.
Yeah, right.
Uh, and so again, they're commanded to do this. They have to do this. They're priests, right? But and there are a couple other, well, burial in a way is another. There are these instances in the Hebrew Bible, not only where it's natural, unavoidable, or more or less unavoidable, right? Sometimes defilement is commanded. It is the byproduct of doing God's work.
Interesting. I was going to ask you, do we even know the whys of the red heifer outside of the temple? I'm sure that's up to everybody's guess, correct? Or do we know?
So, sometimes the Hebrew Bible tells us what it's thinking, right? So Sabbath is a symbol of, the freedom or a memorial of creation. Circumcision is a symbol, sign of the covenant. And at times the Hebrew Bible uses explicit symbolic language. Some scholars approach this and say only in these cases is it symbolic and everything else is just, others, and I fall into this trap, we tend to think that symbolic thinking is not always articulated. And so we try to extrapolate, but, we have to be careful. It's interesting. I think this exercise of imagining, like I just did before, understanding ritual purity as imitatio Dei. Can I prove it? No, I can't. Am I certain I'm right? No, I'm not. Do I feel that we're better off thinking that ancient Israelites thought symbolically? Not right. Not all symbols are explicitly articulated. Yes, I believe that as a scholar. And so I am intrigued that the Numbers 19 ritual a is a paradox. Which is just a fancy word for contradiction, right? In some ways, right? But it's a fascinating, right? It's full of these tensions and conflicts, right? Presumably, right? Though here, right? Why is it done outside of the temple? Well, because this ritual produces defilement, you can't have it inside the temple, right? So some aspects of that are practical. That doesn't answer the question of why this ritual
Right.
defiles.
Yeah.
Why, right? One theory, I'm pretty sure this is in Jacob Milgram's commentary, he suggests that it's almost like it's working like a sponge. The material is absorbing
Interesting.
defilement. And so
Interesting.
that could be, but we don't.
Yeah, amazing how they come to those conclusions. Like, let's get the red heifer, let's kill him outside, and that will be a sponge. Sure, whatever you want. Okay. Now, on the other side of this, of where like the moral impurity when it's connected to idolatry, sexual transgression, bloodshed, we understand a little bit of what made these things different from what you were explaining before. But what were the consequences of something like that? I'm sure it was different than just go get cleansed.
Right. No, the consequences are much more dire. And again, there are passages concerning this in Leviticus 18 and 20 regarding incest and some of the other transgressions. Numbers also has some passages concerning idolatry and others. And then actually this language shows up in some of the prophetic texts, Ezekiel in particular. And here, the process of the moral impurities, these things that actions that cause defilement, right? Defile the land, which is, so here I think we need to try to imagine this. I think bloodshed defiling the land, right? Well, it happens on the ground, and and the blood goes into the ground, and there are those, and then the blood can cry out from the ground. But here, I think ancient Israelites thought of this sense of, well, sacred property, or sacred land being desecrated, right? So sometimes when we substitute that word, this all of a sudden, which isn't, it's just we're trying to explain concepts that sometimes helps people understand moral defilement, desecration a little better, right? And desecration is cumulative, right? And so that's why this is slow. Uh, but Ezekiel, right, his descriptions of this process, right, all of a sudden the temple, ancient Jewish society is just full of these things from his perspective. And what happens, when the land saturates and all of this backs up, right, at the temple, right, bubbling over almost, right, then the divine presence departs. And Ezekiel describes that. Leviticus talks about exile as a result.
Gotcha.
And so the moral defilements lead this language, abominations, sinfulness accumulating in the land, highlights the temple being defiled, right? And of course can't remain, and so he departs. It's described dramatically in Ezekiel chapter 9, and I think that many scholars connect Ezekiel with the priestly tradition. There are all sorts of literary and also, I'm arguing, these conceptual contacts between Ezekiel and Leviticus, the priestly tradition.
So the consequences of this being unaddressed, we're talking, like you said,
Yeah.
exile, the departing of God's presence. And
Right,
things
right.
like
Right, and then positively, what could prevent it? Well, atonement, right? Stop doing it, right? This is cumulative, right? So in this sense, the theology or the right Jeremiah operating at the same time isn't quite using all of this language, but still this idea, the consequence, right? Right, good behavior can outweigh the bad, right? It's not inevitable yet. Maybe the decision can be averted. Ancient Israelites came to understand, right, that that's how this happened. But of course, these texts, Ezekiel, even Jeremiah, certainly, all believe that this exile and departure of the divine presence, um, these are not permanent. Right? These are things that can then be undone again by atonement, God giving the people a second chance.
Many Christians read the prophets as rejecting the sacrificial system altogether. Passages like I desire mercy, not sacrifice," get quoted a lot. I know you push back on that reading. What were the prophets saying?
So, thank you for asking me that. Yeah, so that's right. And by the way, it's not just Christians. There are all sorts of readings of ancient Judaism that I think are framed by later perspectives. So many Christians come to believe that the Old Testament is replaced by the New. Actually, that's pretty common, right? But then that Jesus' sacrifice replaces temple sacrifice, with the implication that something must have been wrong, right? Many modern Jews actually believe similarly that prayer replaces sacrifice, that sacrifice was an inadequate spiritual expression, and that prayer is a better one. And many of the Jewish scholars of the Hebrew Bible are shaped by this perspective. as well. So it's not a distinctly Christian problem, right? It's not a problem that a Christian reader could solve by picking a book written by a Jewish scholar, right? It's a little more complicated, but you're right. These are things that we can all be more sensitive to. And it is based in part on readings of the prophets, but it's based on selective readings
I
of
gotcha.
the prophets,
Okay.
and all of these texts, right? Even Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew tells the person to reconcile with his brother and then give his gift, right? Right. So even within New Testament texts, if we just read against the grain, we realize that there are, right, this notion of anti-templism or anti-sacrifice is there are reasons to wonder how strong that is. But to go back to the prophets, yes, there are these passages, right? I want this, but not, right? Not but structures are so complicated. It's also, right? The not buts, I come not to the righteous, but to the sinners. Does that mean that Jesus wants nothing to do with righteous people? Like that can't be, right? These are priorities, right? Often the not but structure is a prioritization, right? Not necessarily a rejection of what precedes. So that's one important thing. And then there are, all sorts of aspects of prophecy that explain. Right now, I'll just point to two passages, just positively speaking, even Hosea, right? When he describes that that separation, right? There's that analogy there of when the prophet is living without having sex with his wife, that's supposed to be analogous to the Israelites without sacrifice.
Interesting.
Wow. Right? This is giving us, right, properly performed sacrifice connects with God. And so the point here is, why are the prophets so upset? And I think prophets like Amos, but also Isaiah and others really give us the clue, right? Amos is so upset with sacrifice because the people are thieves,
Gotcha. Interesting.
right? They have stolen, right? And this is key, right? There's that wonderful passage where David is atoning and insisting on purchasing the plot of land. Right, this is at the end of First or Second Samuel. Sorry, the passage is slipping my mind.
Okay.
Right, but insists on purchasing the plot. Right, Orana wants to give him. I'll give you this. You can have it all. And David says no, because I cannot sacrifice to God something that I did not pay for, something that I did not acquire. Right, sacrifice has to be yours. Right? And a prophet like Amos, who feels that, they're selling the poor for shoe, whatever, right? Right? And silver and lying down beside, by the altar, by all of these things, right? All of this involves theft, taking what's not your own, right? So it's not just this. We sometimes think that the prophets want you to be in a state of mind right before sacrifice or something like that. No. Sacrifice is material, sacrifice is stuff. And the prophets are offended by people offering to God what they can't claim onto their own because they're stealing from the poor.
Right. Hmm. You mentioned before, and I'm gonna focus on this now. The sacrifice was not primitive or spiritually empty, but organized around this concept you mentioned of imitatio Dei, or imitating God, which is pretty interesting when you think about it. How does specifically sacrifice imitate God?
All right. So one of the things I think we need to do, right, in order to understand sacrifice, one has to, right, we talked about the biases against sacrifice, right? And so we've addressed a couple of them, the Christian perspective, even the modern Jewish perspective of prayer replacing sacrifice. There's also, we've talked about, by encountering the prophets, we've worked against this idea that somehow, that we've encountered the idea that sacrifice is really stuff, right? It's material. All of these things help. Another thing that helps is remembering that sacrifice is actually a really long process. It can't happen without ritual purification. It can't happen also, right? In order to have the material for sacrifice, you have to have unblemished animals. Right? So this means that somewhere in the background, there are priests and others who are taking special care to preserve elements of their flock to make sure that they are protected from these, anything that could potentially render them improper for sacrifice. And that's caring, right? God is the shepherd, right? Right. The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want. Here, just the careful shepherding is also all of this, and this is all preparatory, but all of this is leading somewhere. Ancient Israelites aren't allowed to sacrifice a mother and its young on the same day. They can't be killed on the same day. You have to remember who's who in your
Yeah,
flock, right?
sure.
You have to tell them apart. They all look the same to us, right? But
Yeah,
of course, if actually you may well have listening to your podcast non-urban farmers or others who encounter animals much more directly than most
right.
intellectuals do,
Sure.
right? And so this too is important. And all of this leads, right? The guiding, the preparation, the purification, all of this then leads to this moment where these things are brought together. And then, yes, at a moment, right, the priest exercises the control over the life and death of the animal and then examines the animal in between. And those aspects too can be understood this way, right? Controlling life, but also God. Um, there are expressions in the Hebrew Bible, and these get carried into Jewish liturgy, perhaps in Christian liturgy too. Please tell me. The notion of God sort of looking at the inside. The Hebrew expression is bochen klayot valev, examining the kidneys and the heart. It's usually translated metaphorically, mind and heart.
Okay.
Um, right? God looking inside. God is the one who knows the human secrets. But the priest, actually, this expression describes this aspect of the post slaughter sacrificial process of examining these things and just figuring out what goes where. Then, of course, God is a consuming fire, and the sacrifice is consumed.
Sure.
So all of those things, right? The
Fascinating.
whole process from beginning to end. I really think imitatio Dei is one of these ideas that's explicitly articulated many places in the Hebrew Bible, and then therefore applies in all of these other ways.
Really beautiful,
I
fascinating
can't
stuff.
prove it. I can't prove it, but it is. But thank you for letting me share it with you. I'd be curious.
Yeah, it's absolutely
What you and your
fascinating.
readers.
So some of the arguments in the positions you have put forward are just really awesome. Another one was that sacrifice function to attract and maintain God's presence in the temple.
That's right.
So can you walk us
That's
through
right.
how that worked?
Sure, right. So now that we've talked about right sacrifices imitatio Dei in sort of this general sense, right, then we want to think about what sacrifices do. And indeed, right, there's no doubt Leviticus 16 is there, and many sacrifices perform this atonement corrective function. But it's important to remember that that's just some of the sacrifices, right? In Leviticus 16, ritual is done once a year. So many of the other sacrifices are happening daily, extra ones on Sabbath. And I do think it's helpful to think of them as constructive, right? And therefore not just undoing, right, what sin does or something, but constructive. And yes, attracting the divine presence, right? The rituals are performed, the sacrifice, especially the daily sacrifice, is burned, and then divine presence is comes in, right? I think in terms of invitation, one of the dramatic stories is Exodus chapter 40, right? Where the Israelites build the tabernacle, they perform these rituals, and then the divine presence, the fire, the kavod, the glory, appears and right. But the sacrifice
Precedes that.
precedes that. It sets up the sanctity, and therefore it attracts, and then of course maintains the presence of.
Mm.
And then of course sin can send it away,
Can repel it. Yeah.
right? Right, but and then other sacrifices can then, please come back.
Right.
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 Right. But sometimes we start with that end,
Sure.
thinking that sacrifice is just this restorative, reparative, as opposed to constructive.
Interesting. I see a lot of that bleed over today into Christianity. You got my mind going a million miles a second here because it's. I'm like, man, this relates. This is why this, or this is why some people think this. But really, again, fascinating stuff. The word supersessionism comes up a lot in your work. You argue that later theological frameworks, both Christian and Jewish, have distorted how we read the ancient sources. What are some of the biggest distortions that you see?
So, first of all, I want to be clear that my issue isn't criticizing Christianity or criticizing modern Judaism. It's recognizing how whatever perspectives we may hold may prevent us from understanding what other people thought, right? So I wanna be clear what my point here is, that I'm not, right. I'm not counter Christian or counter modern Judaism, or right. All of us, whatever our perspectives are, we need to every once in a while make sure that are we understanding them, right? And for most, right, Israelites really are a them. I mean, yes, many Christians find a connection between ancient Israel. Many Jews find a connection between ancient Israel. But we have these things. Sometimes we think we're a little better than them, or we've improved. We believe in people who believe in human progress, inevitably believe these things. Right. So for Christians, it's the supersessionist notion, like in Hebrews, that argues that ancient Israelite sacrifice was just inadequate to the task, right? And a Christian who believes that, who wants to understand Leviticus on its own terms, has to, I think, just set that aside for a moment and recognize that ancient Israelites didn't believe. They believed, so what did they believe? If we want to understand that, we have to set that. Similarly, there's almost a Jewish supersessionism, a modern Jewish supersessionism. It's not entirely modern. It actually begins with Maimonides and a few other people in the Middle Ages who actually recognized that prayer, they believe that prayer is better than sacrifice. I mean, almost all modern people believe that prayer is better than sacrifice, either because it's more communicative, or it doesn't involve killing
Yeah, I was gonna say more
animals, right?
practical. Yeah, I haven't
A
killed a
little more
red heifer at the
practical,
church recently.
or aesthetics,
Yeah.
right? Those of us, and I include myself here, right, who don't perform sacrifice, but who do eat meat. I'm not a vegetarian. The elimination of sacrifice really is sort of a net. There's no net gain for the animals, really. It
Right.
just changes things
Right.
where they die, right? It doesn't, right? If you're eating the pastrami sandwich when you go home, it's not. Right. So, so there's that. Now that's two things. It's prayer replacing sacrifice, and that's also really some modern notions that I actually am I said I'm not a vegetarian. That's true. But at the same time, I'm fascinated by these issues, and I'm really interested in, I think all of us do well to think about our relationship with animals. We cannot understand sacrifice without thinking about our relationship with animals, because sacrifice is about domesticated people who had domesticated animals and controlled their lives. And by the way, domesticated animals don't die natural deaths. It's just not how, right? If you're a shepherd, that's not, your sheep are not going to die of old age. That's not how it's going to work. They're right. They're gonna serve certain functions and live out a certain lifespan, and then serve various purposes, food or whatever it is. So I think all of those things, right? So there's like sort of a Christian supersessionism, there's this Jewish supersessionism, and then there's also just all these modern ideas about human progress, about how we relate with animals. We have to sort of undo all of that um, in order to appreciate sacrifice. One quote I like to bandy about is in the book, and I also like to mention it to my students. When we go back into a sacrificial world, and here we can learn something from the philosopher Sallustius, profoundly anti-Christian writer, so I don't expect you or anyone in the audience to listen, but every once in a while, right, someone can put their finger on something, even if you disagree with them. He pointed out that, argued in defense of the Roman sacrificial system, prayer without sacrifice is just word.
Hmm.
And that's sort of a helpful reset
Yeah.
for right? Sacrificial society is just, we're so removed from it in all of these ways, inevitably shaped, right? Though not everyone, right? There are rituals, right? There are some cultures where sacrifices are still performed, but most of us and many of those listening to your podcast probably are a little removed. And if we really want to understand it, it's different. Understanding doesn't mean we have to go back. It just means we can enhance our own, you know, uh, self-critical or just better informed way of appreciating how things were.
Right. All right. 70 AD. Temple
Hmm.
falls, destroyed.
Oh.
What happened to a people whose entire system of relating to God was tied to a building that no longer existed?
So that's a tricky question, right? Now you're right. Far be it from me to downplay the significance of the temple for Second Temple Jews. It was a really important place, and a lot rided on it. I'm not sure everything did. So many Jews lived in the diaspora. And so they maintain a connection to the temple, but it's at a remove, right? And so that's that. Let's also be clear, right? It's not just the temple that's destroyed, right? For Jews living in the Second Temple period, they're mourning the temple, and they're also mourning their people who are dying,
Yeah.
people who died, right? And that's tragic too, right? And then some of the survivors are being enslaved and being brought into the diaspora and elsewhere. So the suffering continues, right? There really is, this is a catastrophe, not just a building and a place and a connection with God. That said, synagogues already existed. Ancient Jews didn't have all their eggs in the single temple basket, right? It wasn't sola tempula, it's not, right? Right? That wasn't good Latin. Right, there were other. So it's a pillar, right? There's a rabbinic passage, right? Torah, avodah, gemilut chasadim, that the world rests on three pillars, right? This may not be pre-temple, certainly, right? And that to translate, that's the world rests on Torah, right? Teaching, and avodah, sacred service, and acts of loving kindness. Now, right, a three-pillared leg, you pull one leg, it's going to fall off, right? So maybe that, but on the other hand, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, right? So, and then other forms of service can still continue. So that's one piece. And of course, the other thing that one needs to keep in mind for how a society would respond to something like that is that there's the built-in narrative when we're talking about the destruction of the Second Temple. It's not unprecedented, right? It's the destruction of the Second Temple. The narrative, the idea that the covenant would continue beyond the destruction, the answers are all already there,
Right.
right? Wow, I guess that was a mistake, rebelling against Rome. I guess fighting amongst ourselves was a mistake, right? The Civil War aspect of the rebellion. Many rebellions have civil or as part of what they are. Um, and so, that you have most of the self-reflections are banding about ideas that already had played out. And so writers who talk about this, well, Josephus and then later the rabbis, most of them are able to talk about the destruction of the Second Temple using sources from the Hebrew Bible, whether it's Lamentations or Jeremiah or others. So the script to follow is there. So it's yes, a catastrophe.
Dr. Klawans,
But
nope, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I just yes, a catastrophe, but one that the internal traditions of the Jewish people had answers.
Sure. Sure. I got two more questions for you before
Okay.
we bounce out today. I have to hit on this. When we turn to Jesus and the Gospels, how should we understand his interactions with purity and the temple? Was he rejecting the system, or is something else going on there?
I think, and here, right? This is boy, this is a big one to toss in at the end. So, look, I tend to think I agree with those scholars who presume Jesus was a Jew, Jesus was operating within the system. I do think Jesus was arguing with the system. But let's take that passage like Mark chapter 7, right? So you have uh, the eating with unwashed hands, the critique of eating with unwashed hands. You have the ambiguous, in my view. It's not what comes into your mouth that defiles you, it's what comes out of your mouth. And then, of course, the later Christian tradition, and in my view, and the view of many scholars, that gloss that says that 719b in many versifications, right? Thus he declared all foods clean. I don't think Jesus said that. I don't think Jesus intended that. And I think the strongest argument is that this is all about unwashed hands, which is a rather abstract, right? If the gospel writers really wanted Jesus to say you could eat pork, the story would say that Jesus and his disciples were, having a ham sandwich and, or something like that, right? It's much more nuanced. I do think Jesus had critiques of his society. The Gospels don't give us what the answers would have been from Pharisees or Sadducees, right? And polemics are often distorted but I do think Jesus had, maybe well thought that people of his age, didn't have their priorities quite right and wanted to reset priorities. But just like the prophets didn't reject sacrifice, I think there's a lot of evidence, like that passage we quoted on that earlier question. Jesus tells that person in Matthew chapter 5, reconcile, then go back to the temple, right?
If a pastor or church leader has been teaching that Old Testament purity laws were about like earning God's favor, or that Jesus came to abolish an oppressive system, I guess what would just be your advice? Where could they start reading or studying or learning some more about that?
Yeah. So, I think there are plenty of good. I mean, I guess my books might be a
You
place
got
to
to promote your
start.
book, which we'll link in the bottom of this, by the way, in the description.
Right. But I think Jacob Milgram wrote a commentary in the Interpretation series. He was a very sensitive Jewish scholar. And that might be a little more addressed to some of your audiences. I think there are very good places to look. I think separate, I think shun the binary, right? That would often be my advice, right? One does not need to put down the Pharisees to celebrate the achievements and the perspectives of early Christianity, right? One doesn't need to do that. And so at least that would be right. So yes, there are things to read about that, but I think a lot of it is also right. The question of whether one's going to slip into, and this isn't just a Christian problem. Anyone can be slipping into the binary thinking problem that we have the answer and the rest of them are the bad guys, bad people, right? Shun that thinking. it is always worth thinking about, well, what would that person have said? How could I shake that person's hand, right? And actually recognize that they too, right? And so in that sense, there's one of the things, academia can sometimes, right? Academics too can fall into this. Arrogance is not just the realm of religion. Or binary thinking is not just in the realm of religion, but we can all expand our minds in the spirit of humility, recognizing and trying to find the humanity of the other, right?
Wonderful. Dr. Klawans, thank you so very much for your time today. It was a really fascinating discussion. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for reaching out.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.